Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's topic is on dyspraxia and understanding what dyspraxia is. We're going to be discussing a few practical supports that we can provide for our children that have difficulties with praxis or with motor planning difficulties. But before we start, I just wanted to introduce myself for those that don't know me. I have done a few chats in this webinar series, but my name is Kate Reeve and I'm the owner of Upside Down Therapy. We are an occupational therapy practice based in Brisbane. I'm originally from South Africa and I have a very special interest in supporting children that have sensory processing difficulties and providing sensory integration therapy. I have completed many professional development courses around this topic, and one in particular is called the Ayers Sensory Integration Therapy, which is through a global organization called CLASI. They provide education about sensory integration and how to apply that to your therapy and practice. But today we're going to be exploring a little bit more about dyspraxia and just really understanding how important sensory processing is and the vital role that sensory processing plays in movement, but also how dyspraxia can affect children and how we can support them both at home and in the classroom. So before we start, I just want to get a gauge with those that are here this evening. Whom of you are parents and how many of you are educators, or if you are anything else, if you can just type it in the chat box just to give me a bit of a gauge on who are you here representing. Are you the educator or the parent? Are you another therapist? What is your role this evening? Oh, all educators. Thanks, Karthik. Well, it's so lovely to have you all here this evening. It just gives you a bit of a frame of reference to how we'll be talking this evening. All right, so just an overview of what we'll be covering tonight. So we'll be defining what dyspraxia is and how it looks or how it presents across the different age groups. We're also going to explore sensory integration and sensory processing and the vital role that it plays in motor planning. We'll be looking at the impact of dyspraxia and how it impacts daily life. We'll be discussing some assessment and treatment approaches that therapists might use when working with children with dyspraxia. And then we'll go through some practical strategies that you can use at home and in the classroom. So before we start defining or understanding what dyspraxia is, I thought it'd be important to first really define and understand what praxis is. So praxis is essentially the ability by which we can figure out how to use our hands and our body in very skilled tasks. So for example, it might be playing with toys, or it might be using tools such as a pencil or a fork, whether it's building a structure out of a toy block tower or a house, or engaging in many other occupations. So I'm just saying, Ekam, thank you. I can see you're an educator and a parent holding your baby. That's okay. So praxis essentially involves 3 different processes. Okay, so when we're wanting to do a motor plan or when you're wanting to do a motor action, there's 3 different processes that are involved in doing this. The first one is ideation. So ideation is when we come up with that plan of what we want to do. So for example, we want to do an obstacle course. So in our minds, we come up with the plan of how we're going to be moving our bodies through that obstacle course. The next one is motor planning. So this is where we use our body to accomplish that task. So that's when we actually move through the obstacle course. Okay, and then the last part is execution. So this is how we determine whether or not we have accomplished that goal. So putting those sequences of actions together. Okay, so being able to then complete that and then review it and think, did I actually do what I thought I was able to do? Or did that feel like I thought it was going to feel like? So Jean Ayers is an American occupational therapist. She's also a psychologist and a neuroscientist, or she was, who developed Ayers Sensory Integration Therapy. And she described that good sensory processing, or the ability to use our senses, is really essential for praxis. So we need really good ability to, for example, process touch so that we can understand the boundaries of our bodies. If you think about the tactile sense or our touch sense, it is essential to be able to understand and move through different movements because we need to understand where the boundary of our body is. We need good vestibular processing, okay? So that's our processing of balance and motion. We need good proprioception, which is understanding our body awareness and where we are in space. So we need very good vestibular and proprioceptive processing so we can understand force and direction of movement. So how are we going to move our body through space? But also understanding what our bodies are doing without having to physically and look at and see what our bodies are doing. We need good visual perception or visual processing. And this is so that we can understand affordances of objects. So that means understanding the qualities of objects and what the qualities are. So whether, if you see a ball, you know that you can't stand on a ball, the ball is going to roll. Okay, so we need to be able to use our sight in order to determine the affordances of objects and understand what the properties mean. And obviously then also understand the space that we're going to be moving in as well. We need really good auditory processing. So this is essential for processing spatial awareness or understanding and following verbal instructions. So you can see how important it is to have all our sensory systems working effectively. I have done a big talk on sensory processing earlier on in the series. So if you want to learn a little bit more about sensory processing, head over to the sensory processing webinar. A child then has difficulties with processing these sensations, it can really disrupt their ability to plan and perform different movements. So, for example, if a child doesn't feel where their body is in space, they might struggle to climb stairs, okay? Or they might have difficulty catching a ball, or they might have difficulty navigating through an obstacle course, or even placing little block tower together. So being able to understand how much force they need to apply to put the balance one block very precisely on another block to build a big block tower. So when we're looking at dyspraxia, it's also known as Developmental Coordination Disorder, or DCD. So you'll find that we use DCD, or Developmental Coordination Disorder, and dyspraxia quite interchangeably. So if we're talking about dyspraxia or DCD, it's a neurodevelopmental condition, okay? So this means that it's something that children are born with, and it's about how their brain plans and carries out different types of movement, rather than it being something that is caused by intelligence or by parenting or poor parenting, or maybe the environment isn't conducive. So it's something that they're actually born with, okay? So it's the way that the brain develops, and it affects the child's motor planning and the ability to learn new motor skills. So it's not to say that the kids will never learn a motor skill. It just means that it's going to take them a bit longer to learn a new motor skill. So children with DCD will have difficulties with learning and coordinating those motor skills. And this can often then affect things like tying shoelaces, or the ability to write neatly and quickly, using cutlery, so using a knife and fork, or using a spoon effectively, or even catching and throwing a ball. And it's important to know that these challenges are not because kids are not trying, okay? It's not because they are choosing not to engage in these activities, and it's also not linked to their intelligence. So if a child has poor coordination, it doesn't mean that their intelligence or their cognitive processing is impacted. They might be very bright and they might be very smart and really, really motivated, but the way that their brain processes movement is very different. And because motor skills are so deeply tied to independence and school participation, these difficulties can often impact not only their learning, but a lot of times it impacts their confidence and their social interactions. The next slide I'm going to show you is a video of a young girl that has been diagnosed with DCD, and it's just going to talk a little bit around what it felt like for her to be able to understand what this means for her. So let's have a look.
It was kind of hard when I was younger, and I was seeing all the other kids like running and really fast or swimming and winning the races, and I was seeing them doing that, and I was putting the same amount of effort, and I was wondering, why can't I do that? And that was a bit hard for me because I didn't know why I wasn't like them.
It was horrible not knowing why our child was finding it so hard to do things that my husband and I did so easily. Neither of us are Olympic athletes or state athletes, but we were always it was easy to do anything. You'd pick up a tennis racket, you'd play volleyball, you'd do cricket, whatever you did, it was easy, you know, just played. And it was so hard as a parent to look at her and go, I get it.
We've all heard of the saying, he or she is not the sporty type. Well, this can flow into other areas of their daily living. So not only do they have trouble catching a ball, jumping, running, playing sports and games, they can have trouble with using a knife and fork, tying their shoelaces, getting dressed, doing up buttons and zips. As they get older, shaving, putting on makeup, driving a car. Well, for these people, it's not that they're not trying hard. It's not that they're just being lazy. They actually have a great deal of difficulty with movement. This condition is called Developmental Coordination Disorder. And we all need to be more aware of this condition and how these people are dealing with it and what we can do to support and help them with dealing with these difficulties.
When I first found out that I had this dyspraxia, it was actually something of embarrassment for me. I didn't want people to know, and I was a bit ashamed of that. But then I decided that I shouldn't be ashamed of that, and that's just part of who I am and something I'm trying to overcome. So it was no longer something that I should try to hide, just something that I should, like an obstacle that I had to get around.
So having had then the knowledge that there was actually something, that there was a reason why that she was finding these things hard, was like an epiphany. It was such a relief. It was such an amazing relief, because all of a sudden we could help her. This was not a case of her being on her own anymore. This was us being able to help her and to say, yeah, okay, we know it's tough, but guess what? We know why now, so we can move forward together.
So it's really interesting seeing it from their perspectives as well. And as for Genevieve, research suggests that approximately 5 to 10% of all children are dyspraxic, which is a large number. And if you think for children like Genevieve that aren't felt understood, how challenging that must be for their self-esteem. So that works out to about 1 or 2 children in every classroom. And it's more common in boys. So we found that the prevalence is 3 to 1. And it's more common than what we actually realize. So knowing this can help us normalize it and validate children if they are struggling. So just being able to be there to support them through it, and validate their feelings and provide those supports that they need. And it's important to know that these difficulties can often continue into teenage years and even into adulthood, and can have a large impact on their mental health. So it's really important point here is that we are able to recognize these challenges early on as educators and as parents, and to provide them with the right supports, and just knowing that we can make such a huge difference to not only their childhood, but also into adulthood as well. So when we step into the early sort of intervention phase, and when we step in that early phase of development, we can help children develop skills, we can help them adapt by using different strategies, and we can actually protect their confidence and their well-being as they grow up. So I just wanted to debunk a few myths. So one common myth with dyspraxia or DCD is that children will grow out of it. So the truth is, while all children will develop different rates, DCD doesn't actually disappear. So without targeted support, most children will continue experiencing difficulties into adolescence and adulthood. But if we are able to intervene early on and provide that early intervention, that support that the child needs, we're able to change that trajectory into adulthood for the child. Another myth is that it's just clumsiness. So we've all heard of a clumsy child. The DCD or dyspraxia was previously known as the clumsy child syndrome. So it just shows that when we do have a child that's clumsy or that doesn't have as coordinated motor movement as what a lot of our other children would have, it might be worth start to question whether or not this child has dyspraxia and referring for an assessment. Clumsiness is something that we all experience from time to time, but developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia is more than that. It's a recognized neurodevelopmental condition that has very clear diagnostic criteria. So there's a big sort of assessment pathway that we need to complete in order to meet those diagnostic criteria. And it really has a big impact on the child's life and their learning. So some families still worry that it might be their fault, and poor parenting or lack of practice is to blame, but that's not the case. So parents are not to blame at all. And in fact, parents can play such a vital role in supporting their child to succeed. So it's got nothing to do with your parenting style. It's got nothing to do with your parenting approach or how you build your connection with your children. But knowing that you can make such a big difference in this child's life is what's important here. So we're going to look at how dyspraxia or developmental coordination disorder might look across different age ranges. So I know you're probably most likely all within that kindergarten age. I know there's a baby in the group here as well. So, and there might be some older kiddies that either are your own or that you are able to support later on in life. So having a look at dyspraxia, it can actually impact many areas of their life, and it can lead to a lot of frustration, it can lead to a lot of anxiety, it can lead to a lot of low self-confidence and low self-esteem. Children might say, I can't, or they might want to avoid tasks altogether. So at the preschool age, the signs that you might be wanting to look out for DCD can be quite subtle, but they're still noticeable, and they often present as delayed milestones from a young age. So developmental coordination disorder isn't officially diagnosed before the age of 5, but you might start noticing those early subtle signs from a young age. So, for example, a toddler might be delayed in crawling and walking, and it might even just be subtle. It might be, 2 months out of the norm range, which is still within the norm range, but on the sort of later cusp of development, or they might even be significantly delayed as well. A 4-year-old or a kinder-age child might avoid playing on playground equipment while they're watching their peers sort of race ahead. And it's not because they don't want to play, but it's because it feels too hard, or it might feel very unsafe for these kids. A child might struggle with getting dressed, so they might have, fumble or have difficulty with buttons. They might get frustrated with trying to get their socks on. They just can't motor plan. And we see it so frequently in our kindergartens where kids can seamlessly some kids can seamlessly put their shoes and socks on, whereas others will take so long to try and get that done. Even going to the bathroom, being able to pull their pants up and down. Some kids just learn it, so easily, whereas others find it really challenging. During meal times, you might notice that meal times are very messy. So these kids often spill things. They have difficulty using cutlery. You wonder how on earth they got food, where they got it, in their hair, all over their, on their face. And the key feature is difficulty learning new motor skills. So sometimes kids will learn those, hopping and jumping skills because they practice quite frequently. But when we do assessments, we might assess a motor plan that they haven't yet learned. So it might be something new. And even if they practice it with lots and lots and lots of practice, they always take a bit longer than their peers to develop that skill. Okay, so it's slightly different from being just that late bloomer. It's a little bit more significant than that. All right, in the primary school years, what we might find is difficulties with fine and gross motor skills. So obviously handwriting here is a big cue for us. So it's often one of the first red flags. A child may have fantastic ideas, so the most beautiful, imaginative imagination, but they just can't get it onto paper as quickly or as legibly as what they would like. And that can often mask their true abilities. So children will then be marked down on the work that they produce, but essentially they've got the beautiful skills and they've got the ideas in their head and they just can't put it down onto paper. So you might also notice that they'll be struggling in PE or on the playground. So doing those more gross motor activities, they might be a bit slower or a bit less coordinated. They might always be chosen last for those team games. And you can imagine what that will have, that impact it will have on their confidence, their friendships, their social skills, their self-esteem. So it's really important to be able to identify all these difficulties. They may have difficulty following multi-step instructions or organizing tasks. So, for example, getting ready for school in the morning could be a bit challenging. Following that sort of sequence of patterning in the morning routine might be a bit challenging. They might have difficulty getting dressed and putting on their shoes. They may be clumsy or have frequent accidents and drop things. So these kids are frequently sort of walking, and because their sensory processing might be impacted. So body awareness, for example, they might be bumping into, doors, or they have difficulty carrying more than one object at the same time. So they have to carry their lunch bag and their water bottle and their jumper and their hat to the front door, and they're constantly dropping. They're unable to sort of coordinate how to do all those tasks together. They may have difficulty opening their school bag or their lunchbox, or even being able to unwrap their lunch items. And I'm sure you see this, right? I'm sure you see, in comparison to their peers, which children have big difficulty coordinating all these movements. So children with developmental coordination disorder typically appear quite uncoordinated, and they're quite awkward with their movement, and the movement can be quite disorganized. It might be poorly timed. So, for example, like catching a ball, we'll notice kids will, close their hands, way past or way before the ball has reached them. They might be slow in their movements. They might be a bit unstable. They might rush through activities and just to hide or to sort of mask their difficulties. And you can imagine that children with these movement difficulties must work very hard. They work very hard both physically and cognitively to move, because they're constantly having to reevaluate and try and think of a different motor plan or a different way to move their bodies. And it usually takes them a lot longer to accomplish tasks that others would typically do fairly quickly or fairly spontaneously. And they'll fatigue very quickly performing the tasks that others would generally find quite easy. It's important to link this to academics as well. So our kids often know the answers to things, but like I said before, their written output doesn't reflect their knowledge, which can lead to that under sort of achievement not being recognized, or their abilities not being recognized by their educators. I can see, Glenda, you've asked the question whether if children are born with it, what causes it? The cause is still unclear. Okay, so they're still unclear as to what could be causing it. We do know, however, that sensory processing plays a vital role. And a lot of our kids that are sort of premature, or their sensory systems haven't matured. It could be things like perhaps prolonged maternal bed rest, where there hasn't been as much input into the fetal development. Like I mentioned, if they're born prematurely, their sensory systems haven't matured either. It could be, whether there's neurodiversity. So a lot of our kids with ASD have developmental coordination disorder as well. Even our kids with ADHD. So a lot of our neurodiverse kids might present with that. So yeah, the cause itself is a bit still unclear, but we do know that there is a high likeliness when there is sensory processing difficulties. All right, so for adolescents and adults, so for adolescents, the challenges might then shift to more of those sort of complex tasks. So things like organizing daily, their homework skills, maybe learning how to drive. You can imagine how many new motor patterns we have to learn when you're learning to drive. It's an activity you've never done in your life, and having to coordinate your hands, your eyes, your feet, your hearing, your vision. You have to coordinate so many different sensory systems and so many parts of a motor plan to do one simple task as driving. When you're driving to work tomorrow, just have a think about what you're actually doing. And for us, also for some, it might be, very easy and it's like second nature to us. But for those that have DCD or dyspraxia, learning to drive is a massive task for them. Managing sports is another one. So obviously in adolescence, as they head up into high school, playing sports is really tricky, and you can imagine how that would then impact their self-esteem, and then those social expectations as well. So difficulties with their coordination don't just vanish as they get older. They might just look a little bit different. Some people might experience a lot of anxiety as well, or low self-esteem after years of feeling so different from their peers. And it just shows how important that transition planning into high school is so important, and whether or not that there's going to be support for them. There's lots of support that we can provide, which we can talk a little bit about later. Vocational pathways, what life skills they're going to have to learn. If there are any examination accommodations that can be provided for them. It is a verified diagnosis, so there are definitely pathways to provide adaptations in the school environment. But also at the same time, so it's not all doom and gloom, and at the same time, many individuals with dyspraxia will adapt really brilliantly with the right supports. So taking a strengths-based approach to help them see themselves as capable and resourceful and being able to achieve is really important. Okay, so we just have to try and get them supports as early as possible and to develop that self-esteem and that confidence, because they adapt. Children adapt so beautifully with the right supports. So when we're looking at those co-occurring conditions, like I mentioned previously, it's important to highlight that it rarely occurs in isolation. So it rarely occurs just on its own. So many children that have developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia might also have ADHD. It does fall under that umbrella term. So with dyslexias as well, and dyscalculias and dysgraphias. And also those that have sensory processing challenges, like I mentioned earlier. Anxiety is also very common, especially if they faced sort of repeated failures or exclusions. So this means that the picture that we have to see in everyday life is quite complex. So for a child, they might be struggling with handwriting because of developmental coordination disorder, but they'll also have attention difficulties because they might have ADHD, for example. So that makes it even harder for them to sort of stay on task and to be able to complete those activities at a high skill. So let's talk a little bit around how dyspraxia or DCD is diagnosed. So it's based on international criteria through the DSM, and it boils down to 4 main sort of points. So the first one is that the child's motor skills are significantly below what we'd expect for the age. Okay, so we look at it, might do standardized assessments that look at their motor skills in comparison to children of their age or their peers. And if we believe that this is significantly lower, then we'll start considering whether or not dyspraxia is evident. The difficulties will interfere with their daily life. So like we mentioned, there's a lot of different areas in daily life that can be impacted, whether it's playing sports, whether it's learning, whether it's writing, whether it's feeding or their daily living activities. So we look at how it interferes with their daily life. We also look at whether or not those challenges have been present from an early development. So like we said, those early sort of difficulties are quite subtle, but they are definitely there from an early age. And then also we have to exclude any other conditions. So obviously we have to exclude motor disorders like cerebral palsy, for example. We have to also exclude things like head injury. We have to exclude cognitive impairments or cognitive challenges, because you can imagine if you do have cognitive challenges, that ideation, that first part of motor planning will be impacted as well. And then it might not actually be dyspraxia, it might just be the cognitive impairment that's impacting their motor movements. So we use a variety of standardized and sort of clinical observations. So some of the standardized assessments that us as occupational therapists might use include the movement ABC, or the BOT. It's the BOT, and those assess motor skills. So that assesses things like fine motor skills, their gross motor skills, their dexterity. It looks at different sort of activities and a lot of sort of familiar and unfamiliar activities. And then the gold standard assessment is called the EASY, which is the evaluation of Ayers Sensory Integration. So this assesses sensory processing and how sensory processing then impacts motor movements as well. So it is used, you can use it in conjunction with the other standardized assessments like the movement ABC or the BOTS, but it essentially looks at the sensory processing components. We might also do parent questionnaires. So it's called the Developmental Coordination Disorder Questionnaire. So there's a little one as well for kids under the age of 5. So if we do suspect that there are challenges below the age of 5, that's called the little DCDQ. And then from the age 5 upwards, there's the DCDQ that we ask parents to complete. We also obviously do our observation. So therapists will watch how a child moves. They might watch how they respond to touch or how they can approach new tasks. And we'll often talk to parents and educators to understand the child's challenges. So to try and understand what their daily challenges might look like. And obviously, as an Ayers Sensory Integration trained therapist, I will look for patterns in sensory motor behavior. So how sensory impacts motor, and that will help me tailor my interventions. Assessment is really best done as a big team. So we use a team approach for this. And this it might involve an occupational therapist or a physio to look at their motor skill development. We will then consult with a pediatrician or a GP to rule out those other medical explanations that we need to exclude. And then we might even have a psychologist to assess if there's a cognitive or learning difficulty. And obviously, as parents and educators yourselves, you provide the most valuable information for us about what it looks like in their daily settings. So it's really important for us to know how it impacts on their daily life, which is that second sort of criteria that we need to consider. And then in practice, the pathway might look like this. So as the parent or educator, you'll notice what's going on. So you might see those difficulties in physical education class or sports or in their handwriting. You'll then raise your concerns with the parents or the school support team. And then from there, they might make a referral to the GP. The GP might then refer to the occupational therapist, who will then do the assessment. The OT will then complete the assessment and then we'll share the findings with the team. And we as occupational therapists can't diagnose, so then we'll then collaborate with a pediatrician to determine whether or not they believe that dyspraxia meets or the assessment meets the dyspraxia diagnostic criteria. So while the process sounds quite complex, it's key for families and educators that you guys are the vital role in that early identification and early recognition stage. And referring is really important because the sooner we can identify these children that do have these dyspraxias or developmental coordination disorder, the sooner we can provide them with the supports so that we can support them throughout their life. And like we said, it's not just about supporting them now for childhood, but it's really to support them into adulthood as well. So just looking at evidence-based practices. So as you can see on the screen, that's our therapy practice, and we use lots of different modalities. So this is using a sensory integration approach. So one of the practices is obviously being able to help the child engage with the world more comfortably, and to support their motor planning through activities that are tailored to their sensory profile. So we do quite an in-depth assessment on what the child's sensory processing abilities are like. And then we will use tailored interventions to support the development or the maturation of those sensory systems. And with maturation of the sensory systems will become more refined motor skill development. So for example, we might use things like swings. So in the picture it's called a cloud swing. So it's a spandex swing. And you can imagine how many small body adjustments the child needs to make when they're working in spandex or in lycra. We might use heavy work or proprioception. So giving them a lot more body awareness to help with that proprioceptive development and understand what their bodies are doing and how their bodies are moving. We might provide some tactile exploration play, which will then help them obviously determine their tactile sensations and understanding where the ends of their body is. And all this will obviously then help improve their coordination and their confidence to move. So alongside sensory integration therapy, we can also often use things like task-oriented approaches. So co-op is one of those approaches, and that helps children help them practice specific goals in a structured way. So for example, this could be like handwriting or dressing or playground skills. So the co-op will use we'll use a simple framework. So for example, the child will set a goal. They'll then make a plan to achieve their goal. They'll actually do or carry out the task to complete the goal, and then they'll check their outcomes. So we call it goal, plan, do, check. And this encourages the child to be quite independent and help problem solve their little skills. So we might get handwriting, for example, and we'll ask the child, what do they think they need to do to improve their handwriting? What is the difficulty here? Then we'll make a little bit of a plan around how we're going to do that. We'll carry that out, and then we'll check to see whether their plan works or it didn't work. And that could be things for, like we said, like for dressing, it could be for handwriting, it could be for any motor task that they find challenging. When we combine these approaches, we then get a much more effective approach. So using a variety of different types of treatment approaches will help support their overall development. So let's think about some practical strategies that we can use in the classroom. So obviously we can make a few sort of universal adjustments to make a big difference. So things like allowing the child extra processing time, especially if there's sort of a transition or a new task or activity that they need to learn. It's important for these kids to break down tasks into small manageable steps. So if you are doing something like, for example, a dressing, break that task down into smaller steps. So we know, like, for example, having to put a shirt on, first you have to orientate it in the correct way. Then we have to make sure it's front to back. Then we have to put it over our head. Then we're going to put one arm into the hole, put the other arm into the hole, and then we're going to pull down. So you can see actually how complex just putting on a shirt is for these kids. So break those tasks down into more manageable steps will create a lot more success for them. Using multimodal instructions is another beautiful way. So just giving them, you can have maybe a visual of how to put their shirt on. You can speak to them and explain how to do it. You can give them, different, other varieties and things that you can provide to support that understanding. And obviously it depends on the child's level of understanding. Providing movement and sensory breaks, so being able to provide them perhaps with a little wobble cushion, and that might help them engage or focus better, and maybe even encourage their efforts and not necessarily focus so much on the outcome. So a lot of these kids don't often have a very neat outcome, or they might not be able to achieve as well as what their peers have, but really just to encourage their efforts, because we want them to at least try, and really for them to understand that it's really about the trying than that the end product or the outcome of that activity. And obviously, as kids get older, educators can then provide alternate ways for the child to provide information. So, for example, in primary school, you might offer them using a typewriter or iPad these days, or computers. You might offer a scribe, so someone standing next to them and being able to scribe for them. You could provide them with principal worksheets to reduce the amount of handwriting that they have to do, where they just have to perhaps fill in the blank words. And all these things will then help reduce their motor planning difficulties and the impact that will have on their learning. So taking away some of those barriers to support their learning and allow them to have access to education, allow them to explain or provide the information that they actually have cognitively, but they just can't do it motorically. For handwriting specifically, OTs or educators can also provide supports, like they might need an adapted pencil grip. They might be able to use alternative pens, so perhaps using one that has a roller ball rather than one that is quite sticky when they're writing. You can understand like what it feels like to write with a pencil versus a pen. Having fluidity, obviously fluidity in writing is challenging for these kids, so having alternative pens for them to trial is important. Reducing their ability or the need for them to copy from the board can also help reduce that frustration so that they can participate. Sometimes focusing the shift from being perfect and having that perfect handwriting to just having really great content. And this is particularly important during assessments and especially timed tasks. So these kids find timed activities or timed tasks quite challenging. And then in PE and on the playground, for example, you can provide modifications. Maybe you could use a larger ball or provide them with a lighter ball. You can create predictable routines, or maybe you can support them or provide a buddy with them that has a similar skill level. So if you know that Johnny has difficulty with ball skills, you might put a peer with Johnny that also has difficulty with ball skills, or you could practice the ball skills with Johnny by breaking that activity down and practicing with him prior to that PE or prior to that activity, just so he has a little bit more practice than his peers. And all these strategies can be part of the child's IEP plan or their school adjustments. And it's just important that we're setting very, very small measurable goals to help track their progress, but also to keep the expectations realistic for them. So for example, a child that has difficulty copying from the board could receive, like we mentioned, like a printed notes so that they don't have to copy as much. And there's small sort of adjustments will help support their confidence as well. And then at home, the most effective approach is to practice specific tasks in short, motivating chunks. So if you are teaching shoelace tying, we know how tricky this can be for most of our clients or most of our kids. So just practicing that into small steps. So for example, practice it once or twice a day rather than in long frustrating sessions. So you don't want to try and teach the whole routine of shoelace tying. You might just do over, under, and a knot, for example. Especially not doing it during a rushed morning routine. So we know how stressful our morning routines are. Now is not the time to teach the child how to do shoelace tying. You can encourage more like a strength-based activities. So for example, if the child loves going for swimming lessons, maybe that might be a good idea to start teaching them how to put their swimmers on. Or if they love going bike riding and that really motivates them, maybe we could now start teaching them how to put their shoes on for bike riding. But even with bike riding, you know, allowing them to have those sort of training wheels on for a prolonged period of time will also help develop those skills. And of course, emotional support is so important for them as well. So validate their feelings, especially when tasks are difficult, and celebrate even just those small wins so that they can have good self-esteem and they can be motivated to engage in these tricky activities that are really hard for them. And also avoid comparing them to other children. So just focusing on what their unique strengths are so they can build up that confidence and motivation. Okay, so let's look at a real life example. So let's talk about Stevie. So Stevie is a client. Obviously, we've used a different name for confidentiality reasons. So Stevie walked a little later than typical and is currently still finding running and climbing stairs quite tricky. The playground activities, he finds it really hard to engage in these activities with his peers and will often just prefer just to play alone and do a quiet activity. At kinder, he avoids group games and he does become quite frustrated when they have to do fine motor activities, like if there's puzzles or drawing set-outs, he avoids these altogether. At home, he struggles with dressing and feeding and often refuses to do messy play. So as a result of Stevie, his confidence is obviously low. He can get quite upset when he has to try new motor tasks, and obviously withdrawing from his social groups and his peers often happens because he feels that he just can't keep up to the skill level as what his peers can. So thinking about like what practical supports we can do for Stevie, I might give you guys 2 minutes. If you can give me one classroom adjustment that you might do for Stevie and one little home activity that you could do. If you wouldn't mind just popping that into the chat, and we'll have a look at those to see what ideas you've come up with. You can keep your answers quite short, so no need to type up lots of long answers. Yes, Glenda, so starting with ball rolling games, they as introduced to young children. Yep, that's it. So if they have difficulty with ball skills or playing, they can, you know, it can be their little role to roll balls to younger children. Beautiful. I love that activity. Transferring activity. Indira, what do you mean, if you don't mind elaborating a little bit more on that one? Yeah, Glenda said he might be more keen to do a fun mode activity with a friend, like a puzzle, for example, and even perhaps finding out what his favorite theme is. If he loves dinosaurs, how about doing a dinosaur puzzle with him? So working on his interests to help support engagement in those tricky tasks. But you're right, yeah, having him do it with a peer, and even a peer perhaps that is at the same skill level as what he is. So he doesn't feel like he can't do it as well as what his peers can do it. All right, so transferring objects from one to another. This is one of the very popular Montessori activities to help their fine motor skills. Yes, so being able to, yeah, transfer objects. Yeah, absolutely. And some other things that we might be able to do, for example, at home, if it's, for example, dressing that is difficult, maybe we can chunk those tasks down into manageable steps, linking them to meaningful goals, like being able to get ready to go out to the playground or to go out and do their favorite activity. So kids will be a lot more motivated. We know how it is when they know that they're going to be doing something that they really enjoy, and that might be a good time to teach them that skill. You could use visual schedules to help organizing and sequencing with their morning routines. You might even avoid using clothing that have buttons. You know, there's so many other types of clothing that doesn't have buttons or zips or buckles that they find really tricky. And then practice one piece of playground equipment at a time. At school, like we said, we could provide larger or less complex pictures to colour in. So maybe we can have a thicker outline in comparison to what their peers need to do. If they have more fine motor skills, they might have a more complex picture, so having different types of pictures available to them. Maybe getting them to use a water paint rather than using colouring pencils, because a water paint will cover a larger area of space. Maybe, like I said, practicing transferring objects from one to another, practicing with peers, using their interests, so what they love doing, and to see what we can do to help motivate them when they know that it's tricky. And obviously validating his feelings. So, you know, celebrate those small wins. And I saw, Indira, you had, or Glenda, I think it was you had a comment at the top, which I'll get to it a bit later on, but you're asking like how you can do to help him have a more positive attitude and validating his feelings. And you can say, yeah, that is really tricky. It is tricky. How about we learn this together? How about we break this down? How about for today, we're not going to learn how to kick a ball. We might just learn to balance it under our foot and see if we can learn to balance. So just really validating them and just, you know, celebrate those small wins. If he balances for 2 seconds, oh, wow, you did such an amazing job. We have to try and build up his self-esteem. We can see how much it is already impacted and how much more is going to be impacted the older he gets. So looking at some of these red flags, so obviously we might see that child having difficulty using movement in new or different ways. They might have gross motor delays like catching or jumping. They might tire more easily than others. They might have quite awkward or clumsy movements, bumping into things, difficulty with things like handwriting, getting dressed. They avoid tasks that require a lot of movement. Using cutlery, and even difficulty planning those movement sequences, like when you're learning a new dance routine, for example. And then, of course, if you suspect that the child has DCD, obviously speaking with the classroom educator, you're the parent. You educators play such a vital piece of this puzzle to solve, and document those difficulties in the daily activities that the child is having, so that you know when you do the right supports, we know how to do it. So obviously you'll be, oh, sorry, I think I'm on the wrong slide. But yeah, referring to an occupational therapist who's experienced in working with children that have motor skill deficits, where they'll complete the history taking, and then obviously determine whether it's the right adjustments for them. So those types of adjustments might include rest breaks, the special format papers that might have larger print or adapted lines. They might be able to use oral, speak rather than writing, providing a support person for them, so having a reader or a scribe, using a computer or having assistive technology, or even just modifying the environment. So perhaps they could use a different room that has different lighting. Perhaps they're sensitive to certain types of lighting. Maybe they're very sensitive to noise and they might need a quieter environment to work within. And obviously we know that when we informing parents and educators or parents is always, or caregivers is always such a difficult thing to do. But just know that by doing that, you can provide the family with the right supports. So thank you. What I might do is I might refer to some of those questions. I know, Glenda, you did have a little question. So you said that you have a child that is over 4 years old who has some difficulty coordinating movement and finds it even hard to catch or kick a ball. He avoids these tasks and said it's too hard. You want to encourage him, but he's got very strong beliefs that he can't do it. And we find this so often. Our kids are very clever. They know when they get to that age, they know that they can't do it. And sometimes he will try, and when he doesn't go to plan, it will affect him emotionally. And, you know, that, yeah, what might reinforce to him that he can't do it. And like I mentioned before, what's important here is to make sure that the task is set to his skill level. Okay, so try and determine where is the breakdown, where is he having that difficulty with, and how we can break that task down into even smaller, more manageable steps. And then, of course, you know, if it's something that's persistent over sort of more than just one skill area, it might be worth considering referring him for an assessment. So if his coordination and his ball skills are significantly lower than what his peers are, you might want to consider having him referred. And I can see your follow-up question is, how do we get them to have their child assessed or diagnosed? And yeah, it's always so tricky, hey, because I feel as educators, you're always the bearer of bad news, really, and it's really hard for you to have to tell the families that there are challenges, but just think about what impact you can have on that child's life. So if you are able to support that family or that child now, imagine what you can change their whole trajectory. So you might want to approach and just say to the family that you're noticing that he has really big difficulty with his motor skills and that it's starting to impact his self-esteem. He's really not motivated to engage in activities where he has to play with his peers, and he gets highly emotional, and you can see it's starting to impact his self-esteem. If they wouldn't want to maybe perhaps consider having a motor skill assessment done with a physio or an occupational therapist, just to rule out whether there's something going on, or maybe there's additional supports that they can provide, or even as therapists we can provide things like a home program. There's also a lot of different referral pathways, so in terms of funding options. So they can chat to their GP and they could get something, Medicare rebates. It's called a chronic condition management plan. And it's that they can get up to 5 rebated sessions per calendar year to access allied health supports. There's also the NDIS, which is a little bit more of a process. But if there is a child that has developmental delays, they can get in touch with NDIS, which is the Benevolent Society for this age group in Brisbane, and they could be eligible for additional funding supports, so NDIS supports, and then they can use that funding to access occupational therapy or physiotherapy for that diagnosis. So it is a bit of a process, but we also have to, determine, if it is just a motor delay or if it is DCD, because if it is DCD, we have to also provide some form of intervention to see, whether or not it's just a little bit delay and we can catch them up, or is it going to impact their movement for the rest of their life? And it's not to say that these kids don't learn these skills. It just means that it takes them a little bit longer to learn skills. There are many dyspraxic adults walking amongst us. You might have even identified yourself as being dyspraxic. You might have thought, life has always been so hard for me. It's taken me so much longer to learn to ride my bike or learn to ride a car or learn to cook a recipe or, doing any of those. I've never been a sporty person. And you could potentially have had dyspraxia. So it's not to say that you can't achieve. It just means that life is a little bit trickier. And if we can intervene at an early or at a young age, we can really change that child's trajectory, specifically with their self-confidence, their motivation, their moods, their social engagements. There's just so much of a difference that you can make if we can get the right supports for them. If there are any other questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat group. Otherwise, my email is on the screen. You can email hello@upsideDownTherapy.com.au, and I'd be more than happy to support or provide any supports. I'm just going to go back to my references page. There is a DCD Australia website, and there's some really wonderful resources on there for educators knowing how you can support kids at different age groups. And then DOTWA, which is Western Australia OT Association. They also have some beautiful resources. So there's some really lovely Australian-based DCD websites and resources that will be specific for our Australian population, but also within our school curriculums and how we can best support our kids. So yeah, you're welcome to go across to those websites to explore a little bit more and understand how you can support your kids. Well, thank you so much for everyone for coming tonight. I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you have a little bit of more better insight and go back to kindy tomorrow, watch how your little friends move at kindy, and think about how we can best support our kids that have these challenges. Thank you so much.